First, complex code base. Why does it happen? Although on this slide I've put in here architectural ideals, I've seen really two ways that this can happen. The first is when you tend to see it if you've got like a lone developer working on a project. They're working in isolation. They're probably not used to working in a team, probably haven't worked in a team for most of their career. And they have this idea of how they want to put something together and they just kind of go for it. And that going for it is not always in the right direction. Now, this doesn't always happen, but you can get lone developers working on their own that are doing things in an industry standard, consistent way that any other developer can come in, look at their code and know what to do with it. You also get the opposite, where people look at the code and think, what is going on here? I don't get it. It's so strange. So that's one possibility, but that isn't the one that I'm really going to talk about because it's less common. What is more common, and what I've seen quite a bit of, is teams of developers, sometimes architects, and trying to achieve architectural ideals. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you go searching for architectural patterns or design patterns on the internet, you're going to come up with a lot of results. You're going to come up with a lot of ideas. And what we've seen is that if you apply those ideals without some critical thinking behind it, then you can get yourself into a position where you are creating a code base that is extremely complex. When I talk about complex, I'm really talking about the effort involved in making changes. And really this comes into technical debt, which we'll talk about more later. But the best rule of thumb that I have and that I can provide you with, because I understand that not everyone on this call is going to be technical, which is fine. This isn't necessarily going to be a technical webinar, or it isn't going to be a technical webinar. The best rule of thumb is if you're managing a dev team or you've got dev partners that are working on something, ask them a question. If I want to add a property to a model, so just say you've got a bunch of users and you say, hey, I want to add something to that user object. So let's say I want to start collecting their address, whatever it is. Ask them, how many files would they have to change in their code base to achieve that? I have seen code bases, and I'm not kidding here, where you have to change like 20 files to do something simple like that. That is complex. That means that you've got, anytime you make even a very simple change, you've got 20 files you've got to go through to find them. You've got to make the change. You've got to make sure it all works, and they're all got to, line up and so forth. The point is that there's a lot of effort involved in doing a very simple change if you make the code too complex. The principles that I like to keep in mind when we do a design, aside from minimizing the number of files I have to change, and my team knows that I'm a little bit allergic to verbose code. I don't like it. I like having things clean and consistent and simple, as in simple to make changes. Maintainable is another word for that. But the principles of lean code, what are they? So, simplicity, efficiency, flexibility, and accessibility. And if you keep those things in mind, then the dev team can, by focusing on those, can more critically assess whether or not a particular pattern that someone has talked about on the internet or that they've heard on a conference is applicable or is even makes sense. Now, if you want a specific example, and I will give you one, it is a tech example, so forgive me if this makes no sense. Don't worry, but if you are technical, this will hopefully make sense to you. There is a very popular design pattern. It's called the repository pattern. Now, the repository pattern is a way of decoupling your data persistence layer, so the database, with your application code. The theory behind it being that at any point you can swap out your database and you can plug in a different database, and the rest of your application doesn't have to change because you've got this design pattern in the middle called the repository pattern. It's wildly popular, been popular for quite some time, and was adopted by a lot of very enthusiastic software developers and employed in code bases all around the world. Great. Okay, so far so good. I have nothing against the repository pattern, but if it's applied without understanding what it is and where you're using it, then it becomes an impediment to maintainability, maintainable code. So the best example I have of this is a lot of people were using entity framework, which is it's an object relational mapper. Again, it doesn't really matter what I'm talking about here, but they were using it with entity framework, and entity framework itself has a built-in repository pattern. So people were applying this design pattern of repositories to entity framework and making the thing quite complex, far more difficult than it needed to be, and in the objective of some architectural ideal, and that was resulting in a complex code base. So the one thing I want you to take away from this section is how many files do I have to change to add a simple property to a class or to an object? And if the answer from your dev team is, it's more than 5, then I would suggest maybe it's time to look at the way that particular patterns have been implemented. To give you an idea, depending upon how you want to use it, in our own code, we get down to effectively 1 on the back end. You really only have to add it to the model and everything else gets handled for you. And, then obviously perhaps 1 on the front end as well, because you want to do something with that property. But that is more what you ought to aim for, in my opinion.